Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today I have a very, very special treat, something that I haven't had the pleasure of doing in at least a few years now. Have Dr. Craig Keener on the show. Hey, Craig, how are you?
I'm doing a great deal. How are you doing?
I'm very good, and very pleased to have you on with this show because I think the last time you were on, it was at least 5 years ago, maybe.
Wow.
On We were talking about the historicity of Acts. That's when your massive commentary came out there, and you were kind of engaging with my atheist co-host at that time. So, yeah, it's great to have you back. And
Great to be with you.
Awesome. And yeah, so today we're kind of looking at the historicity of the resurrection. And there's a special reason for that that you'll find out towards the end. But just before we get into today's topic, Craig, just for those who may not have caught the last episode, do you want to just give a brief intro as to who you are? And talk about your scholarship, because I had an Eastern Orthodox person once tell me, his name's Tyler Fowler, and he was saying that he doesn't find Protestant scholars know how to read the Greek outside of biblical Greek. So he's saying there's a difference. But yeah, what's your, I know you're very well read as a classicist. So yeah,
Yeah, some Protestant scholars just read the Greek New Testament, but and sometimes the Septuagint, which is sometimes easier than certain parts of the Greek New Testament. But anyway, um, yeah, I did my PhD in New Testament and Christian origins at Duke University. That was some years after my conversion from atheism, so I wasn't really interested in the New Testament when I was an atheist. And my Acts commentary, I cite probably 45,000 extra biblical ancient references to shed light on the text there. And I've written 37 books, maybe 19,000 pages so far in terms of books, plus a bunch of articles. And anyway, um, that's probably enough of that. But
fair enough, fair enough.
and I'm a professor of biblical studies at Asbury Theological Seminary.
Awesome. Awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, with that said, I do want to get straight into this topic because it is an essential doctrine. As Paul says, if the resurrection's false, our entire faith's in vain and
Right.
it's out the door, right? We're still in our sins there. Um, but the first thing I want to ask you about is, well, look, this whole thing about the resurrection, uh, there's so many skeptics online that will say, look, this is just a myth. There are these dying and rising gods in the pagan Greco-Roman myths and other ancient Near Eastern myths. So I want to turn it to you. Is this true? Are there cases of a genuine death and resurrection of various pagan gods that are out there?
Some of this, some of this people could argue for just over a century ago. There was James Frazier's Golden Bow, which kind of took disparate myths from all over the world and tried to find common threads to blend them together. And in so doing, was often reading one thing into another and really things that were quite different. There was like a little bit of similarity, and um, so you had this emphasis on mystery cults back in the very early 20th century. And you had some scholars like Bousset, who, Wilhelm Bousset, who, in his Curios Christos, just just went crazy with all these parallels, irregardless of whether they were later than the New Testament or earlier than the New Testament. Some of them were influenced by the New Testament, and and I think it also has something to do with that era, pre pre-Nazi Holocaust era, where people were shying away from the Jewish sources, which are obviously the most close. I mean, if you're going to talk about Galilee and you're going to talk about Jesus, what's closest that you should look to for background there? Well, what were the ideas that were floating around there? And today archaeology shows that Jewish communities in Galilee, they had mikvaot, which are ritual immersion pools, uh, based on Jewish ideology from the previous century or two, um, in terms of ritual purification. You had stone pots, you had which were impervious to ritual impurity. In other words, these are very Jewish communities. They barely even were trading with Gentiles in this period. Most of their trade in Galilee was with Jerusalem and other Jewish communities. So, the first place you would naturally look, archaeology shows us this. Oh, and back then there were also people who were saying that the Galileans were Gentiles, which fits entirely the wrong period. I mean, after Judean settlement in Galilee, about a century and a half before Jesus' ministry, you the population increases something like 5 times over. I mean, the archaeology is clear. This was all Jewish. So these ideas that Jesus was related to these, mystery cults, and how do we know what mystery cults even taught anyway? I mean, some of the vocabulary is not found at all in the New Testament, mystes and things like that, as Sir Arthur Darby Knock pointed out about a century ago in his work as a classicist. But even with that, how much do we know about the mysteries? Well, they were mysteries. You weren't supposed to know much about them. The way we found out about them was that later pagan converts to Christianity who'd been in the mysteries talked about what they saw in the mysteries, and they were talking about it through their grid of Christian understanding, and they spoke of it as a demonic imitation. Well, some of it actually probably was an imitation because the mysteries were very syncretistic. So they would borrow from one another. And as Christianity is spreading in the late 2nd century, they're borrowing from that too. And those are basically most of our sources about what was going on in the mysteries. But having said that, there were stories about gods who came back or people who came back, like Orpheus, who was a person in the myth, Greek myth. He wanted to get his wife Eurydice. I'm trying to pronounce it the Greek way, but we usually see Eurydice or Eurydice, whatever in English, but Eurydice in Greek. He wanted to get her back from the underworld, so he goes down there and he charms everybody with his music and gets her, but he looks back and she slides back into the underworld. Not quite a resurrection there. And then Asclepius is raising people, but these are not like the New Testament Jewish concept of resurrection, which is an eschatological event. It's a transformation. You'll never die again. I mean, anybody raised in the myths, or anybody raised in the Old Testament, or anybody raised in Jesus' ministry, they're raised temporarily. Like if a doctor resuscitates somebody, well, they'll be back hopefully for a while, but sooner or later we all die again. That's different from the Jewish concept of the resurrection. Now, a lot of the things that are supposed to be dying and rising gods, now you do have Osiris. That is pre-Christian. And there were plenty of worshipers of Osiris in the pagan world, not in Galilee, not in Jerusalem. And of course the accounts of the resurrection, we know they go back to within days, 1 Corinthians 15 and so on, which I'm sure we'll come back to. But the idea of Osiris is just magically revivified by the natural potencies that are already in nature, and he stays in the netherworld. He's still dependent on the gods, so, but that was the kind of the closest thing. Then you've got stuff like Adonis and so on. They actually, there's no evidence for people saying that they had risen. I think maybe his little finger would move and his body stayed incorrupt, and that's it until well after the Christian message had widely circulated. So basically, Fraser and those who followed him were taking taking the grid of a resurrection story and imposing it on a whole bunch of other things where there was missing evidence. And it's like, you're expecting to find the missing links, but they never turn up because they're not there. And so, anyway, um, all that to say that, oh, and even Persephone. I mean, Persephone, she goes down to the underworld alive. And then, I mean, she's a goddess anyway, so she's not really dying per se, although Ares got wounded in Greek mythology. But the idea uh, of seasonal revivification in the spring. So, you know, things die in winter and then they come back to life in the spring. That's so different. I mean, that's an annual thing. It's so different from the eschatological resurrection that you've got in Daniel and the Old Testament. That's the basis for the New Testament idea of a once for all permanent restoration of an immortal body.
Yeah, yeah. Even Bart Ehrman, right? He says like, look, Jesus is not a fertility god or a
Right.
agricultural god or something like
Yeah.
that. So yeah, it's the disanalogies are just amazing.
And
So yeah,
and some of the scholars, uh I mean, a century ago it might have been excusable when we didn't have as much information. But like one of the scholars who does stuff like this, um, I call him a scholar. He's got a PhD, he's written books, but I
Richard
mean,
Carrier or yeah,
and
Richard.
I'm not talking about Richard. I actually haven't seen him do this particular thing, but the one I'm talking about has talks about, in the mysteries, they greeted one another with a kiss. And to be initiated in the mysteries, you would be go through a bodily washing. And so obviously the New Testament must get this from and they would eat together. So the New Testament must get this from the mysteries. The only way somebody could say that was if they were totally ignorant of the rest of the ancient world. Every guild, every religious group, including synagogues, ate together. And is in terms of kissing, people greeted one another with kisses, especially if they were kin or part of the same in group. They would greet one another with kisses. That wasn't distinctive to mysteries in any way. And in terms of washings, ceremonial washings, that was used for initiation into anything. I mean, sometimes you'd have to do it before you entered a particular temple, and certainly the Jerusalem temple, you'd have to do it. And of course, the mikvaot uh, that we mentioned earlier, the immersion pools that were used by Jewish people in Judea and Galilee. And if Gentile wanted to convert to Judaism, they'd have to be immersed in water, and this, you know, and this is also acknowledged by Epictetus, who's a Gentile philosopher talking about Judaism, and uh, apparently in Juvenal, another Gentile author, and it's in the Sibylline Oracles. And anyway, we could just go on, but all that to say, the only way they can say, oh, this must be from the mystery religions, is if they're totally ignorant of the rest of the ancient world.
Yeah, yeah. It's night and day, and I like that you kind of mentioned in your answer you went into like this concept of resurrection proper. It's thoroughly steeped in Judaism. It's a Jewish belief kind of thing in the ancient world. And I just kind of want to ask you and probe a little bit further into that. So what, starting with the Old Testament, like what exactly is the Jewish background of the concept of resurrection proper leading into the New Testament? And does that change at all? Because I've heard skeptics say that originally in the oldest parts of the Old Testament, they didn't even have a concept of the afterlife, and then they evolved into a disembodied state, and then eventually by Daniel and the Persian period, they invented this resurrection and copied it from the Persians. So what's your take on the Jewish background from the Old Testament to the New and the development, if any?
Yeah, it's hard to say what they could have gotten from Persians because our Persian sources are all later, as Edwin Yamuchi has shown. Which isn't to say that they couldn't have gotten something from the Persians. It's just to say it's hard to to show for sure. But it is true that there is development within the Old Testament, because in the early parts, I mean, when they talk about eschatology, it's corporate eschatology. That's what they're dealing with. So collective restoration of God's people being gathered to the land. In terms of afterlife of individuals, the issue doesn't come up. Although one archaeologist did point out that they left like holes in the tops of certain burial things, like which in surrounding culture suggested some idea of an afterlife. But that's I don't want to read too much into that because
Is that
it's
breathing holes or something? Or I don't know.
that's he took it as something like that. But yeah, I'm just going to leave it there because it's
Fair
kind of
enough.
speculative how you interpret that kind of evidence. But it was natural in the Persian period in the exile when they do have to, they're addressed with new questions, and so they come up with answers for those questions. But I do think it probably goes back. Well, some of the thing depends on when you date certain documents. I think it's there in Isaiah 26. I think it's there in Ezekiel 37, 1 to 14. Uh, Maybe they're in Job 19, although that could be from the Persian period. Um, the Isaiah 26 is I think pre-exilic, uh, but um, but where it's clearest, and these other things are disputed, but where it's clearest, and I do think you have afterlife things in the Psalms and so on, uh, or things that could go, some things that could go like there's no praise of you in Sheol, but then other ways of looking at it, like I'll be with you afterwards. But Daniel 12 is pretty clear, and it's like kind of a new body thing too. They're compared with stars, and so there's everlasting life versus everlasting shame. Now, even among early rabbis, there were different interpretations, especially regarding the resurrection of the damned idea. But the resurrection of the righteous, the rabbis were unanimous on that. In fact, Mishnah Sanhedrin 10:1 says that um, all Israelites will be resurrected and have a part in the world to come, except certain ones, including the Sadducees who don't believe in the resurrection. They won't get it. But you've got probably implications of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Pharisees certainly affirmed it, is widely documented in ancient sources. And of course, the Pharisees, Josephus tells us, represented the more popular views within Judaism as opposed to the Sadducees. And you've got the Jewish apocalyptic literature that talks about it, and um, and yeah, you have a number of sources both before and after the New Testament period. But certainly Daniel chapter 12 talks about this. Now it's a corporate, collective, eschatological resurrection. So it's something future, and when that happens, it's settled. It's like permanent. So when Jesus talks about it, some people don't believe that he actually predicted his death, or a la Albert Schweitzer even foreknew his death. But there's no way you're going to overturn tables in the temple and challenge the temple hierarchy, or do something like that anywhere in the ancient world, and not anticipate your death, unless you either raised an army or got out of town really fast, neither of which Jesus did. So, I mean, he didn't just predict his death, he provoked it. I mean, he knew he was going to die. So it makes sense that he would have told his disciples in advance. Now, when they would have heard him talk about the resurrection, though, in 3 days, they would have probably taken the 3 days figuratively, because they're thinking of a collective resurrection. So, okay, either everybody's going to rise in 3 days, or it's going to be a while. So he's going to rise, but they weren't expecting it right away. They weren't expecting something like an empty tomb. And yeah. Anyway,
Awesome. Yeah, yeah. I think what well you kind of hinted at this, but just one sort of follow-up question here is well look there are accounts prior to Jesus of resuscitations, let's say. Whereas Jesus is seen as the first fruits, the first and only example of this unique resurrection event. That's at least unique until the end of the general resurrection, so to speak.
yeah.
So, do you mind just very quickly, what is the difference between someone like Lazarus who was resuscitated versus Jesus' actual resurrection there?
Well, Lazarus isn't still alive today. Um, yeah, again, it's the same. We have people resuscitated today, whether you're talking about medically or otherwise, or people misdiagnosed as dead. Sometimes that also happened in the ancient world. You've got a lot of stories from the ancient world about that happening. Many of them very plausible. I mean, you have them in fiction, but you also have them in historical sources, where somebody was thought to be dead, and then they actually usually they were pretty sick and they didn't last very long. They died again right away. But but you know, out of millions of people who died, once in a while you get it wrong, um, or they recover. And uh, of course, the ones with Elijah and Elisha, and then the widow of Nain's son, uh, Luke Luke 7, and Jairus's daughter in Mark 5, and Lazarus in John 11. You have, and then Tabitha or Dorcas in Acts 9, and Eutychus in Acts 20, which actually is from eyewitness material, uh, from the we material in Acts. And then you've got it happening again in history with, like, there was a Mesopotamian bishop later who was converted in the year, I think it was 99, when a Syrian evangelist raised somebody from the dead in front of him. You have all these reports through history. We've got plenty of reports today, some of them medically documented, of people coming back uh, as a result of prayer. Um, Things that wouldn't have happened normally without something dramatic intervening. I could go into this in more detail, but these people all end up dying again. They don't get immortal bodies. They don't, necessarily glow like stars. They can't walk through walls like Jesus,
There,
uh,
yeah,
with a new kind of body, or suddenly disappear,
yeah.
uh, or be unrecognizable or whatever. Uh, Paul speaks of that, of we're going to have a glorious body like his own glorious body. And this is undisputed, early letters of Paul. So this is just within, I mean, most of Paul's letters run from between the years 50 to 60, uh, give or take a couple of years, maybe around the edges. And therefore, we're talking about, within the same generation of somebody who's absolutely convinced and takes it for granted that, I mean, even with the Corinthians, where he's got to convince them that they're going to rise from the dead, he's like, don't you understand? Jesus' resurrection is the beginning of that. So you already believe Jesus rose from the dead. Look, you got to accept the implications of that for us. This was widespread, so far as we can tell, unanimous belief among Jesus' followers in the first generation.
Awesome. So I'm glad that you brought up because I was going to ask the follow-ups here. So, beyond just the immortality of the resurrection bodies, that it will also be a glorious resurrection body. So you think perhaps, maybe we'll have transdimensionality or we can walk through walls kind of thing like Jesus. What about questions of like, so for example, Jesus, he appeared with the wounds
Mm.
as well, or the age. Do you think that's gonna are we gonna be resurrected as the same age if we die in our 80s? And are we going to have wounds? So if I get my head blown off, am I going to be walking around like the headless horseman? What was the Jewish concept of resurrection on that front?
There were actually different ones. Now, a lot of them took their starting point from Daniel, and they spoke of being like stars. Of course, we have a better understanding of stars being just hydrogen and helium, but that wasn't part of the analogy back then.
Yeah.
So um, for them, it was like uh, bright and heavenlies. And so, Paul speaks of a heavenly body versus an earthly body. He speaks of a spiritual body versus literally a psychikos, you could say soulish body, natural body, our current body, but which is fitted for the life of suke, like God breathed in Adam breath of life and he became a living suke. So we've got our current bodies are like Adam, but like the new Adam, the last man from heaven. I'm doing 1 Corinthians 15 here. We will have heavenly bodies. He compares them like with stars and other things in the heavens. So glorious and different in character from our current and moved pneumatikos, spiritual, moved by the Spirit. So the Spirit raised Jesus from the dead. Paul talks about that elsewhere. The same Spirit already at work in us. We have a foretaste of resurrection life already at work in us, but we will have resurrection bodies um, totally transformed by the Spirit. And you've got Paul talking about this kind of stuff in First Thessalonians, which may be his earliest letter. Some people say second earliest. You've got it in Philippians, which is toward later period. Pretty clearly there, he's going to come back from heaven and we'll get bodies like his. You've got it in 1 Corinthians 15. I see it in 2 Corinthians 5. Some people say, well, that's not talking about the resurrection body because he says we have it already, but we have it in the sense that it already belongs to us, not in the sense that we've already put it on, to use Paul's language, because he says we have the down payment, we have the foretaste of the Spirit. So we have that guarantee already. But the language he uses is so much like 1 Corinthians 15. I think he's talking about the resurrection body there as well. So it's and for Paul, it's like this is, well, just like for churches that recite the Apostles' Creed, I believe in the resurrection of the body. Well, that's, it's pretty fundamental to the Christian faith that we do have a future hope, and it's not just disembodied floating around, but it's not this kind of body. It's a different kind of body.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's one thing I was always wondering. Like Paul, he describes the disembodied state as like almost being naked, like there's some kind of
Yeah,
incompleteness
yeah,
there. So, yeah, we're designed to have souls and bodies. So,
yeah.
okay, all right. So I do want to kind of transition into looking at the evidence then, right? We've kind of described what is the resurrection, where does it come from, and that sort of thing from a Jewish perspective, but. In terms of evidence, so I want to first ask you, another scholar, Dr. N.T. Wright, he wrote like a 700-page book on the resurrection. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but
Yeah.
he talks about the seven mutations. So that these are things that they're dramatic mutations of belief from the prior Jewish belief to what the early Christians were actually teaching. And I just want to highlight about three of them to kind of get your take. And see, do you think that these are good evidence that these are such dramatic mutations that it would require an actual resurrection to explain them? So the first would be, as you've hinted at already, the timing of the resurrection changes, right? So they had this concept of a general resurrection. That's everybody at once at the end of time when God will judge the earth and that sort of thing. But the Christians had this somewhat from a Jewish perspective, awkward view of, well, no, the first Jesus and then the general resurrection. Um, there is also, secondly, there's a new concept of resurrection. That resurrection is tied to this notion of being born again, of being saved and in right standing towards God. And then third and finally, the Jewish people thought that the Messiah was not supposed to die altogether. That's utterly foreign from a first century Jewish perspective. But now all of a sudden the Christians are running around and they're tying this resurrection to the death and resurrection to the concept of the Messiah. Um, so yeah, what do you make of some of those mutations? Why didn't Jesus followers just abandon Jesus right away and that sort of thing?
Yeah, you may have to remind me of these as we go through them, because that was three different ones. And
Sure.
I'm glad you didn't give me all seven of them, um, but yeah, I mean, there were other movements where the leaders, the messianic type movements, where the leaders actually often promised to sign and didn't fulfill it and got killed, and their movements dispersed, as Gamaliel points out in Acts chapter 5, but as is also evident from Josephus and other sources. I mean, the movements didn't outlast their leader. Um, there were revolutionary movements in general that continued to be revolutionary movements, but they weren't built around the earlier leader, and they uh, they fell apart or um, escalated into the Judean Roman War that was devastating for Judea. Um, anyway, so Jesus' movement is quite different in that. I mean, the others didn't come up with the like, oh wow, our leader actually came back from the dead. Well, where is he? Well, he went to heaven. Oh well, lots of people go to heaven. No, no, I mean he rose from the dead bodily and then went to heaven. It's like, what? Why are you saying that doesn't make any sense? So those weren't things that were normally believed, and it made no sense for the Christians to make that up. It didn't fit any existing paradigms that the Messiah would rise ahead of everybody else. Now, looking back in the Old Testament, you can see it in retrospect based on what happened. So like Psalm 110, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And then he talks about what'll happen afterwards. So that he's exalted for a time until the enemies are put down, or the analogies with the Exodus narrative, where God brought his people out, but then there's a delay through disobedience for 40 years before they enter their inheritance. And so we've got things like that. But uh, all that to say, that was a very different permutation. And I'm trying to think,
Well, one was the another one
yes.
was the timing, right? You've kind of hinted at this
Oh yeah,
yourself.
yeah,
So everyone thinking the general resurrection is where everybody, and now all of a sudden Christians are saying, well, no, there's the Messiah. He would rise singularly first as the
right.
first fruits. Yeah, how could that come about naturally? Yeah.
Yeah, only if they're looking back to it as if having, this is their experience, and so now they're saying, oh, this fits the eschatological resurrection. But um, and again, they're not going to be able to say it if Jesus just appeared and then collapsed again or something like that. Uh, they're the only way they're going to be able to say it is if they saw him and the tomb is empty, because otherwise, obviously, people are going to check the tomb to shut them down, or they themselves surely these kind of things haven't happened before, so surely somebody's going to check. Uh, and so those things together, and especially the multiple independent appearances and appearances to many at one time, and so on. It's just
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. So amazing. Okay.
easily the best explanation.
I want to ask one last thing, and it's not on that list, but it is something N.T. Wright talks about. But I think it's important. So it's the change in the praxis, the practices. So, for example, from Saturday, that's all of a sudden mutated into Sunday worship or something like that. Like, do you think the change in practices of the early church are remarkable, requiring a resurrection compared to previous Jewish practice?
Yeah, I mean the first day of the week was really important to them, uh, and for that reason, the association with the resurrection. I don't I I wouldn't say, like, we have sources in the second century and especially later, that do speak of Sunday as a new Sabbath. The New Testament doesn't actually speak of Sunday as a new Sabbath, but certainly it was the day of worship and celebrating. And I think that's mentioned even by Pliny in his Epistle to Trajan 1096. He talks about the meeting on a early in the morning on a particular day of the week. So that's early second century.
But were you, sorry, you said so there were later second century Jewish texts talking about
No.
Sundays?
Christian texts.
Okay.
Now
Okay.
there are some later Jewish texts talking about minim or schismatics that uh, had a different view of the Sabbath. But I think a lot of Jewish believers still, Saturday was the Sabbath. Well, sundown Friday, as we would put it, to sundown Saturday was the Sabbath. And that's the way it still is in the New Testament. I mean, everywhere it talks about the Sabbath, that's what it's talking about. But but then the first day of the week is a special day of worship. And almost certainly, although I'm reading it back a little bit from Ignatius, but very early second century, almost certainly the um, that's what's meant by the Lord's Day is Sunday.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there is that difference in practice. There was something I was going to
Also circumcision versus baptism as the sign of initiation or something like that, maybe.
baptism. Baptism was already widespread, so I don't know that baptism was a new circumcision. That's something that's debated among New Testament scholars, and sometimes I think we're reading back later understanding back into the New Testament. So I don't know that baptism replaced it um, so much as that spiritual circumcision was enough without the physical circumcision. Because what the prophets had promised with the new covenant, there's going to be God's going to pour out his spirit on his people. So here are God's eschatological people. They have the spirit. Well, here these Gentiles now are receiving the spirit. What does that mean? It means they've already become part of the eschatological covenant, the end time covenant, even without the physical circumcision, which kind of makes the physical sign of the covenant superfluous if you've got what the covenant is really all about. But the thing I was going to mention earlier about the the death, the significance of the death as well as the resurrection, was to look at you've got the resurrection in Daniel 12, but in Daniel 7 you have the Son of Man
Yeah.
that Jesus refers to, and of course Son of Man can just mean human being in Aramaic and Hebrew, uh, Baranish and Ben Adam, but he uses it with like Son of Man coming on the clouds and so forth, which is clearly an allusion to Daniel 7. So when you look at Daniel 7, the Son of Man or the human one comes as a climax, like a few other of the visions in Daniel, to previous empires. So before you've got the human one, you've got four beasts. And these four beasts in Daniel 7 represent four empires and their kings. And so the Son of Man is the final empire, the final kingdom, the kingdom of God, and it represents that empire, but also the king in that empire. And then the Son of Man receives worship, which in the language that's used there in Daniel is only properly applicable to a deity. And yet he's also identified with the suffering saints of the Most High. So God's people are persecuted by the final empire, which by the first century was understood as Rome. They suffer under this final evil empire, but then in 722 they're exalted, like the Son of Man in 713 and 14. I think because of the connection between the king and the kingdom there, that it also implies that the Son of Man, the king, the one who's going to receive worship, whose divine as well as, linked with God's people, he he suffers with them under the horn, under the evil empire, before he's exalted. So that I mean, it doesn't break it out into like him doing it before them or anything like that. For that, I'd go to Psalm 110 or some other text. But the idea is, it's already there that the Son of Man, who's going to reign, also would suffer. And you see this connection made in the Gospels. It also shows us the collective character of it, how God's people do suffer in this age, but just as Jesus suffered and was resurrected, he actually suffered under that final evil empire under Rome. We also will be resurrected with him. He's the forerunner for the rest of us. So it makes sense in retrospect. Once the disciples experience what they experienced, then they could go back and put things together based on what Jesus said about the Old Testament.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's how it kind of works for a lot of typologies or type arguments, right? It makes sense in retrospect, looking back. Like, when you see it like straight on, like, no, I can't see it. What are you talking about? But then when you look at it from just such an angle, it clicks and okay, now I see it. So yeah, I totally get what you're saying there. So
And
okay.
speaking of Daniel and speaking of mysteries, the New Testament use of mystery, um, Daniel actually speaks of the mystery of the kingdom, and the final kingdom that, in Daniel chapter 2, around verse 44 and 47, stuff like that. So all that to say, I mean, it's already there. The raw material was there in the Old Testament.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, Daniel's one of my favorites there. So okay, okay. So going on with the evidence then, I'm kind of curious. So what is some of the best biblical evidence that we have for Jesus' death and resurrection? And I'm curious what you might make of appeal to some of the pre-New Testament oral traditions. Do you think that's some great evidence as well?
The fact that Paul can take for granted that all Christians already believe in the resurrection suggests that there must have been some pre-written belief about it, obviously.
Yeah.
And again, in Paul's earliest letter, well, earliest or second earliest, First Thessalonians, he talks about it. But the strongest, where he delineates it most fully, is in 1 Corinthians 15. Uh, oh, and there's also all this other stuff that goes along with it. I mean, the availability of the Spirit, the churches, like what made me think of it is 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, right before it, where it's talking about people prophesying, you may all prophesy one by one. I mean, that's Joel, the Spirit is poured out in all flesh. That's not normal anywhere else in the ancient world, to have that kind of collective prophetic spirit. I mean, the closest you've got is Qumran, and it doesn't come close. So um, the consummation isn't yet, but something definitely has changed in history. And Peter points that out in Acts 2, and it's all over the place in the New Testament. But anyway, coming back to 1 Corinthians 15, I hope you pardon me. I'm ADHD, so I'm all over the place. And
Oh, no, no, this is great.
organization is my problem. It's not the information, but First
No, this is
Corinthians
great.
15, he actually is citing earlier witnesses, going way back to the beginning, as almost everybody agrees. In the first few verses, he says, "This is the gospel. Um, this is what I mean by the gospel. Jesus died according to the scriptures, was buried, was raised according to the scripture, raised on the third day according to the scriptures." And there he's dealing with, so there's a backstory to it in the scriptures. And the burial clearly shows he's talking about, something bodily. And yet when he condenses it, this is the condensed form of it. The other condensed form of it he gives of defining the gospel in Romans chapter 1 is Jesus, son of David according to the flesh, but raised by the Spirit of holiness, according to God's power. So resurrection is, just like in the speeches in Acts, it's like right there at the heart of the gospel. So right from the beginning. And he also says, whether it was they, the other apostles, or me, you heard it from, this is the gospel. So same message being preached by all of them from the beginning. And he names many of the early witnesses, leaves out the earliest witnesses, the women at the tomb, which almost everybody also agrees that the Gospels were correct on that, because who's going to make that up? But, in official lists of witnesses in that period, um, both in Jewish sources and what we gather from Roman law, the witness of women was rather diminished. Obviously, God didn't think so, since they were the first witnesses he gave. But for the sake of the public testimony, when they're boiling it down, Paul lists people who saw Jesus alive from the dead, and lists himself last of all. And for Paul, it was utterly transformative experience, going from a persecutor to a believer. And I didn't actually persecute people, like trying to get them killed, but I certainly made fun of Christians a lot before I was a believer. So I
That
don't know
atheist. Yeah, you were great. I don't know if you mentioned in the last show you were on, you were a hardcore atheist and that
yeah,
sort of thing for a while. So
I,
yeah,
I wasn't I wasn't impervious to evidence. If somebody had given me evidence, I just didn't think there was any. But if somebody had given me some, I think I would have considered it. But I was pretty dogmatic in that I was, they're nice atheists, but I was not one of them. I made
yeah,
fun of Christians. But
no problem. Well, hey, we all got to start somewhere. So no worries. So yeah, so that's great. Now I do have a follow-up here that I know you're excited, and I'm actually excited to hear about. I want to ask you, okay, great. You've talked about some of the biblical evidences and some of these pre-New Testament oral traditions. What about archaeology? Do we have any good archaeological evidences supporting the evidence for the resurrection? For example, I've heard about this thing called the Nazareth Decree, and I know you've done some research on the Holy Sepulchre, the Golgotha site there. So, what do you make of these archaeological discoveries?
the the Nazareth inscription is more debatable, uh, in that in that it may just be in Nazareth by, well, I don't know if it'd be there by accident. That is kind of a coincidence, um, but I think where I can speak more authoritatively is the Holy Sepulchre, because I think there's really strong evidence there. So how would the site have been remembered? Well, how would it not have been remembered? You know, Joseph of Arimathea, there's good evidence. I mean, who's going to make up like somebody from Arimathea? What's Arimathea? Probably Ramathaim Zophim, but I mean, who's going to, so anyway, but, um, and actually when they were upset with the Sanhedrin, who's going to make up a nice Sanhedrist? And, if he's going to, bodies did have to be buried. That was, Josephus tells us Judeans required that, but they could be buried in a pit or a common criminal's grave. They had to be kept separate so that a year later the families could come and get the bones. Um, but uh, but Joseph wants this body. He's not asking for the other bodies. He's kind of nervous as he comes and asks Pilate, because, well, I'm going into too much detail. I need to stop that. It's because I'm writing a commentary on Mark right now, so I'm really into the gospel narrative. But just cutting to the quick in terms of where the site is and how it would have been remembered. The early Christians certainly would have remembered it. The enemies of the early Christians would have certainly wanted to check it, if they're going to contest with them about it. And also, when Jerusalem's destroyed, it didn't mean that everything was destroyed. I mean, we still have the archaeological evidence, but and then when Hadrian was destroying places, Hadrian, that was one of the sites he desecrated because it was still being regarded as a sacred site by people. So the tradition goes back before Hadrian, but we also know it goes back well before then because everybody knew that burials had to be outside of Jerusalem. But in the years 41 to 44, King Herod Agrippa I extended the walls of Jerusalem, the third wall. The site is inside that third wall, which means that nobody would say, okay, somebody's buried here because it's inside the third wall. But at the time that Jesus was crucified, around the year 30, or some people would say 33, that was outside the walls of Jerusalem, it was outside the second wall. The third wall was built, like if we date Jesus' crucifixion around the year 30, the third wall was built within 14 years of that. So the memory of that site would seem to go back to within 14 years. So earlier than Paul's letters, earlier than 1 Corinthians. And when they dug down in the time of Constantine, because of this persistent belief of people in the local area, this was the right site, they find that there are tombs in the area. Well, I don't think they knew the difference between a tomb from this century and a tomb from that century. But today, archaeologists do, and archaeologists verify that beneath the Holy Sepulchre is a first century tomb. And that area has first century tombs. And it can't be later than the first century again, because after after the year 44, nobody was burying anybody there anyway.
Yeah, I think that this is fascinating to me. I think so. You're talking about, look, this has been excavated by a couple of archaeologists, Dr. Shimon Gibson, as well, Joan E. Taylor, and she makes this argument that she was a skeptic. She didn't believe in this site. Now she's committed believer that this is true based on the archaeological evidence. And I just want to highlight that point you made about the excavations, which would have been impossible for later Christians, say in the time of Constantine or second century. They wouldn't have known about this area, which corresponds precisely to the Gospels and was obliterated in 44 AD when they did this excavation. And so one thing you missed is I understand from the archaeology they've also proven there was a garden in this
Yeah,
area as well.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that
which fits. Yeah, yeah,
awesome.
and yeah, it was the site of an ancient quarry. Anyway, that's not, yeah, but later used as a garden. And yeah, well, there's so much we could say about it. But
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. All right. So far you've kind of talked a little bit about the empty tomb and the appearances and that sort of thing. And you did hint at Paul in one of your earlier answers. I want to kind of focus on what is your take on James and Paul? Is there good biblical evidence that these two were actually skeptics at the time of their conversions or prior to their conversions? And if it is true that they are zealous skeptics, is this phenomenon unique in the ancient world, or are there natural explanations where, yeah, hardened skeptics do actually change and turn around, or something like that?
yeah, well, I mean, throughout history, a hardened skeptic of anything can won't always, but can turn around in the face of considerable evidence. Um, but that's what we're talking about here is considerable evidence. It's like when I was converted from atheism, uh, I still had all sorts of obviously intellectual questions afterwards because I didn't get them all answered right there on the spot. But um, I was an atheist, and then people shared with me the gospel, and then I argued with them for 45 minutes. Wasn't convinced by what they said, but I had an encounter with God, and like, you know, He's not letting me alone. And I'm like, okay, well, it's kind of hard to be an atheist with God in the room with me. So, but I know that doesn't count for other people because that's just your experience. But anyway, in the case of James, Jesus' brothers weren't believing in him in John chapter 7. Um, but especially in Mark. Uh, and Mark really goes after him. I mean, Mark chapter 3, the disciples are bumbling idiots like a lot of us. And then Jesus' brothers actually think he's nuts. So they think he's out of his mind. Literally, the wording means stands outside of himself. In the next chapter, they're the ones standing outside. He can't get in because of the crowds. Um, Mark has a little play on words there, I think, but it's in the same context as the some of the scribes who are saying that Jesus is possessed by Beelzebul, and insanity was sometimes linked with being possessed by a spirit in ancient thought. So, like, his brothers are probably thinking, okay, these people they want to take him out, and he could actually be stoned as a false prophet if it's a false spirit speaking through him, if that's what others think. We think he's just nuts. So we want to take custody of him. That's not a very flattering picture of his brothers or his mother for that matter. And uh, not unanimously, but most scholars think that the criterion of embarrassment here, since these were later leaders in the church, as were certainly the disciples, and we know these were later leaders in the church, Galatians chapter 1 and 2 in particular, and 1 Corinthians 15 and Acts chapter 1, uh, and Acts chapter 12. But anyway, these were later leaders in the church presented in a very unflattering way. The criterion of embarrassment suggests that actually these were things that actually happened. And later leaders are like, yeah, I wasn't quite on board when all this started. I had to learn the hard way. Well, so that's not as strong an evidence, though, as with Paul, because with Paul, you've got Paul himself saying he persecuted the Christians. That's not going to gain him any browning points with the Christians to whom he's writing. And, he's being persecuted for his faith now. So, it's obviously didn't earn him any browning points to be converted, especially when he knew what happens to people that he was persecuting, that it could happen to him too. So Paul talks about this in Philippians chapter 3. He talks about it in 1 Corinthians 15. Obviously, Luke talks about it. It's also in 1 Timothy chapter 1. So, yeah, for Paul clearly switched sides and didn't do so for economic benefit.
Okay, so I have three quick follow-ups, if you don't mind. Okay, so the first thing in terms of Mary, let's start there. I find Mary a little bit confusing here, so I'm wondering what your take is because so in the Gospel of Mark, as you're saying, yeah, she along with her brothers thinks Jesus is nuts. What are you doing? Get back here, boy. I gotta rein you in. But then in other places, she is believing. Like in the Gospel of John, she's like, this guy's special. Like, do as he says at the wedding of Cana. So like, how would you reconcile that? Like, why is she skeptical in one place early on, but then she's also believing? I don't know. Yeah.
And even in Luke 2, she's treasuring these things in her heart. So she knows something, she believes something, but she may be concerned about Jesus getting in too much trouble. And also, Jesus is the eldest brother. So James can't just, I mean, James may be the second eldest, but he can't just like go talk to his elder brother and say, you have to do this. But if he takes his mom along with him, then they've got some bargaining power. And Jesus is able to avoid the issue because the crowd keeps them out. I don't know. Maybe he goes out and talks to them afterwards, but um, his brothers still don't believe in him in John 7, but I think his mother probably had some more. Personally, how you put the evidence together, we've got a lot of gaps in our knowledge. It's 2,000 years later. We can't go back and interview people like Luke did. So um, I'm not a deconstructionist, but I think deconstructionists rightly pointed out that any narrative you have is incomplete. There are going to be gaps in the text. And so when you even interview eyewitnesses, or even my wife, she was a war refugee in Congo, where she's from. And so after after she got out, when we were engaged at that point, after she got out of the war, she would share with me her stories. I would write them down. And later I had access to her journal. And at some points I would find things that I thought were contradictions. So, like, okay, here you told me it was a plastic container, but there in your journal, you said it was a bottle. So which is it? Like, okay, I mean, with memory, we don't expect like complete,
Precisely.
but but because I was able to ask her, I was able to get an answer. She said, yeah, the plastic container was a plastic bottle. Duh. I'm like, oh, I didn't think of that. So, some of
Yeah.
the things we think are contradictions aren't, but when we're at this remove, we just speculate how they fit together. We can't go back and interview people to see how they fit together. So um, that's true with any historical source where we have limited information. We can't answer every possible question, but we can make plausible guesses about, well, this can fit this in this way.
And there is an interesting comparison between Mary, the mother of Jesus, and James, Jesus' brother, because
Mhm.
I've heard Gary Habermas make this argument about, well, look, Mary's at the foot of the cross, so indicating she's a believer at that point and stuff like that. Whereas none of the brothers of Jesus are there. James isn't at the cross, indicating they're probably still skeptical at this point. I don't know if you seem a little bit skeptical yourself of that argument, or
Well, Mary wouldn't even have to be following with the group if she's in Jerusalem for the Passover. I mean, she would be most likely in Jerusalem for the Passover. So would Jesus' brothers. If she, you know, it takes time to die on the cross. So by the time Jesus is dying on the cross, Mary would have gotten word of it, and it would make sense for her to come. As far as male followers and male relatives, they had more to lose. They were more likely to be detained. Not that Pilate really was interested in doing that, but they, it, the risk was higher. Now, of course, I believe the beloved disciple was there. He says he was there, um, and I believe that. Um, but I think it may have also had something to do with who was in greater danger. Now, having said that, and talking about reconciling the stories, um, John Wyndham uh, did harmonization. Mike Licona has shown how things can fit together with spotlighting and so on. But as Gary Habermas pointed out to Mike Licona and to all the rest of us with his minimal facts argument, you don't have to have all those things figured out. You don't even have to have all the details be true. I mean, not saying that they're not, but you don't have to have that. Christianity doesn't rise or fall on this detail or that detail. Rises or falls on whether Jesus rose from the dead. And when you've got a bunch of different sources, like E.P. Sanders, who was he was on, he, I was his TA at Duke.
oh
Uh,
well, yeah.
yeah, E.P. Sanders, at one point he says, well, it's not surprising, some parts of the Gospels, you've got the story going just along, pretty much in all three or four versions. But uh, when you come to the resurrection narrative, you've got a bunch of different ones because it's like this person, I saw him first. No, I saw him first. You've got different witnesses, multiple witnesses who all want to tell this story. So um, the important thing is that they all saw him alive from the dead. So whatever the details, in I like Mike's way of going at it, Mike Lacona's way of going at it, but
Yeah.
whatever the details, Jesus rose from the dead, and that's the game changer.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mike has a great way of phrasing that kind of thing. So yeah, I like that. So okay, my last follow-up question on this is Paul, and I just want to briefly get your take because you will be aware. So like when we're looking at biblical evidence, I think it's crystal clear Paul is zealous for the traditions of his ancestors and the Jewish way, and he's zealous in his persecution of Christians. He hates them. He thinks they're blasphemers and all this. But skeptics seem to bring in, oh no, what Paul really had doubts. He was conflicted. He was experiencing cognitive dissonance and inner turmoil. What do you think of that? Is there any basis for something like that?
That's not what Paul says. I mean, he says, I was righteous according to the law, Philippians chapter 3, and goes on to list his qualifications. People sometimes go to Romans 7, but Romans 7, he's speaking of life under the law, and he's speaking of it retroactively from a Christian perspective. It's not talking about a psychological disturbance before his conversion. Yeah, there have been people who've tried to do psychoanalysis on Paul. I mean, it's hard enough with a living person, uh, but with somebody who's been dead for a couple thousand years and you can't interview them, you don't know about their early home life, the relationship with their dad, all that stuff. Um, it's it's just totally speculative. It doesn't fit the evidence that we do have. Um, he was still persecuting them up until the time, and he was pretty shocked. You know, again, the evidence that we do have in Acts chapter 9, he goes without eating or drinking for 3 days. Uh, eating for 3 days, actually, some of us could probably afford that, but uh, you know, you can't go for much more than. I mean, after 3 days, you're going to start doing kidney damage if you keep it up too long in a dry climate. So um, Paul was, it was pretty sudden, pretty radical, and of course, I would assume he still had questions to resolve. Sociological studies of conversion in the Western world often show how people are uh, socialized into it for a time. But with adult converts, sometimes there is a sudden conversion. It was that case with me. And again, I had a whole lot of catching up to do. The little kids in Sunday school knew more about the Bible than I did. I was completely unchurched. But uh, but Paul, he had the Torah, he had the prophets, he had the background. But seeing how it fit together, you know, his worldview was turned upside down.
Absolutely. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. All right. So the last question on the evidence that I wanted to, at least on the positive side here, is so the appearance to the 500. So this is something that we only have explicit mention in the First Corinthians 15 Creed. But some people try to link it with certain accounts, like in Matthew's Gospel or perhaps the Ascension or something like that. But I'm just kind of curious, based for the biblical evidence for the appearance of the 500, I know some skeptics like Bob Price, who is a mythicist, but he's tried to argue that no, actually, we have no evidence for the appearance of the 500 because after it talks about the first couple of appearances to the disciples, Peter and the disciples, and that the rest of it is a later interpolation. So that the appearance of the 500 wasn't in the original creed. I'm kind of curious, is there any truth to a skeptical notion like that?
Well, certainly there is no evidence for something if you throw out the evidence for it.
Yeah.
I mean, we have the text, there's no evidence for an interpolation. So if you want to explain away every piece of evidence that you don't like, you can make anything an interpolation. If there's no, I mean, there's normally our way of proceeding is the itself is evidence. Uh, if there's if there's evidence for an interpolation textually, or sometimes people will make an argument if you've got a sudden change of subject and then change back, although that's common in ancient literature. It's called a digression. Um, it's very common in Paul. It's even more common with me, but again, I'm ADHD, so what do you expect? But I mean, it doesn't even fit that. Now, if you're saying not an interpolation to 1 Corinthians 15, but an interpolation to the creed, I mean, when Paul adds himself at the end, obviously that's an addition. But I think let me just um, double check this, but I think I'm right on this. Uh, no, and then he has to James and to all the apostles. I don't see how he's going to make that like an addition when it comes before the other. I mean, it's not done. It's still going on for uh, another verse after that. So that makes no sense, but it fits some of his MO and some of his other stuff I've read.
So,
Not Paul, I'm talking about but
so
Robert
just to,
Price.
oh, sorry, just to clarify. So, in your experience as a biblical scholar here, like if there is occasionally on occasion when there is an interpolation, such as with Paul, it's readily detectable by biblical scholars, whereas in this case, there's no evidence at all for an
No,
inter.
there's no textual evidence for it. Um, I mean, there are proposed interpolations that are debated, but if there's no textual evidence at all, you're not going to get many takers. Most scholars are not going to pay attention to those kind of arguments.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Well, look, we've been having a couple
No,
of
no,
couple. Oh,
Dale Allison, he makes. I think he's a very honest scholar, and the way he handles things are worthy of discussion. But some people like to make up evidence or throw out inconvenient evidence.
yeah. Okay. All right. Well, Craig, so far, look, we've been having a grand old time, a couple of Christians agreeing on the positive evidence, but I do want to flip and give some of the shrouds, some of the resurrection skeptical evidence as well, because there are certain biblical contradictions, or at least alleged contradictions related to Jesus' death and resurrection. So I kind of wanted to take us over some of these, about five of them, and get your take on them one by one here. So, okay, so the first one, this is an obvious contradiction, alleged contradiction that is always raised. But look, what day was Jesus crucified on? Yeah, it seems the Gospels have different answers to that.
Mm, most scholars agree it was Friday. Now, are you talking about in relation to the Passover or in relation to the day of the week, literally?
That's a good question. So both. Let's say both, if you don't
Passover
mind.
is more Passover is more complicated, and there are different answers on that among scholars.
Okay.
So, with the some take the Johannine chronology. Actually, a lot of scholars favor the Johannine chronology today. I favor the synoptic chronology and see the Johannine chronology as more um, symbolic
Mhm.
in terms of Jesus isn't just crucified on the day that the Passover lambs are offered. Uh, well, on the evening after the Passover lambs have been offered. So, connecting the Last Supper, Jesus being our new Passover, but that um, Jesus actually gets crucified when the Passover lambs are being offered in the temple. And I'm one of those who thinks that actually John moved the temple cleansing to the beginning of Jesus' ministry to overshadow all of Jesus' ministry with the temple cleansing. Now I know Calvin said there were two cleansings, which is it's not impossible. Um, although you wonder why the um, temple authorities would let Jesus keep coming back and visiting. I mean, they are upset with them in some subsequent events, but that's going back to John 5, not to John 2, later in John. So actually, even evangelical scholars are divided on this one. Um,
I just
but
had Lydia McGrew on my
yeah,
show last week, and
yeah,
she gave the two
yeah,
interpretation there. So yeah.
yeah. But Luther believed that John actually moved it back to John 2. He followed the synoptic approach. And so, I mean, people will say, Craig Keener, you're liberal because you agree with Mark on the, but Martin Luther did too. And, but I also agree with Martin Luther on another point. Like, who cares? What difference does it make? Uh, ultimately. So the yeah, so the Johannine versus Markan, I deal with that in much more detail in my commentaries. I think Brant Petrie handles this really well in his book on the Last Supper, and I think I fully agree with him there. Or actually, he fully agrees with me because I wrote it already in my work. But he takes it way further. But either way, I think Paul Anderson probably takes the Johannine approach, and he makes a good argument for that. Whatever the case, um,
So just to be clear for the audience, like for the layman and stuff like that, um, you're saying, are you saying that you have to take one or the other approach? Like there's no way to harmonize them outside of positing two things. Like there, are you saying there is a contradiction and you have to choose one approach or the other, or
it can be harmonized. It takes a good bit of
okay,
ingenuity, but it can it anything, almost anything, maybe not anything, but a lot most things can be harmonized if you try hard enough.
fair.
But the in terms of ancient sources, I mean, you have this in the case of Jesus cursing the fig tree. So in Mark, they come back and find the fig tree withered the next day. In Matthew, it's withered at once. Oh, is that a contradiction? Uh, you can force a harmonization by saying he cursed two fig trees. Each gospel only mentions one. Jesus gives the same lesson on faith after uh, a disciple gives the same wow each time, 2 days in a row. I mean, the disciples were sometimes clueless, but that's really clueless.
Yeah,
But I think it makes a lot more sense to say that this is the kind of thing that ancient historians didn't get worked up over. You know, this is it only takes a little bit of flex room for this. The same with one day between John and the Synoptics on the which is the actual Passover. But again, that's a whole other subject that would require a whole lot of discussion. And there have been you know the Sadducean versus the Pharisaic Passover, the Dead Sea Scrolls versus the Pharisaic Passover, the you know
goodness,
there's and
there's
then
a lot.
yeah, and then the Egyptian calendar versus so there are just so many options that people argue about.
Fair
But
enough.
in terms of being Friday, the vast majority of scholars agree that the crucifixion was on Friday, and you know where John says it was the day before the Sabbath of the Passover. Um, that doesn't have to mean it was the day before the Passover. Um, it can mean because genitives they just mean some sort of relationship between the two nouns. It could mean the day before the Sabbath of the Passover week.
Hmm.
So in which case it doesn't affect anything. But the 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 thing that people really argue about is Jesus talks about after 3 days. But again, that's because we're reading it in English. We're reading it in a different culture. Part of a day counts as a whole, um, and that's just pretty standard. And you didn't have to count that way, but it was very common to count that way in ancient sources. And Paul probably calculates his 14 years in Galatians 1 that way, and so on. So 14 plus 3. Yeah.
So, okay. All right. Well, here's one that's near and dear to me. But so I actually just was engaging a Christian who raised this. potential contradiction here. And they're saying, well, look, the synoptics say that Jesus was buried in a sindon, which most scholars would interpret as like a single linen sheet. I think you would agree with that. Whereas the Gospel of John mentions linen
Oh yeah.
strips, plural linen strips, like or bandages or something like that, plus the Sudarian. So I just wanted to get your take. Is there a contradiction there? How do scholars understand these things in terms of the Jewish burial practices? And the other thing is with Lazarus, it mentions him coming out of the tomb with the linen being bound hand and foot and still wearing the sudarion. So wouldn't that contradict a single linen sheet or a sindon understanding? So yeah,
You would have something bound around the head to keep the mouth closed.
okay,
And also, I mean, you could be wrapped within a linen sheet, you'd still bind something to keep the legs together. Um, After a person dies and there's rigor mortis, you normally would also have to break the rigor to get the person flat, if you're going to do that. Yeah, I think you could have one large sheet. It wouldn't have to be that, but you could have one large sheet, especially if you had somebody wealthy providing the sheet, and then still have the wrappings to hold the things together. Otherwise, the sheet can come.
binding. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Also, in Mark, where he talks about the linen wrappings, he uses a term in chapter 16, no, sorry, chapter 15, verses 42 to 47 is where Jesus is buried. Joseph wraps him in a linen cloth. And the wording that Mark uses there is the same wording that's used one other place in his gospel in 1451 and 52. And like John, I didn't used to believe this, but as I've been writing a commentary on Mark, I've been seeing this over and over again. Mark is a master of irony. So you've got this guy in Mark chapter 14 who, to save his life, flees from Jesus, even leaving his linen cloak behind. In the case of Jesus, you have Jesus who embraced death for all of us, and he's wrapped in a linen cloak. And so you have this contrast between the two. And um, so I think that helps account for why Mark uses the wording that he does. Um, but again, if Jesus rose from the dead, the details are not, the Christianity doesn't rise or fall in these other things.
Correct. Yeah. The secondary details are secondary, right? Or tertiary
Right.
and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
okay. Just sort of curious though, the in terms of like a single linen sheet, that is consistent with what we know of first century Jewish burial customs. You would agree with that? Or
Of people who had enough money for that.
for
So it makes
wealthy.
sense with Joseph of Arimathea.
Gotcha.
Some people were just dumped, not just dumped. I mean, they were buried, but they could be buried in pits or trenches, and then dirt thrown over them. So
Gotcha.
that was for the very poor. Um, but even with, the whole idea of the criminals' graves that you have in Mishnah Sanhedrin, is it six? Anyway, in Mishnah Sanhedrin, that's a later source. But if you're going to believe that source about the criminals' graves, then you're also going to have to believe what it says about keeping the body separate for later collection. So the body doesn't just go missing. And also, if you're going to, uh, in even if Mishnah Sanhedrin is relevant to the first century, which it could be in some points, but it's probably was written down around the year 220 A.D. So almost 2 centuries after the time we're talking about. We This wasn't a Jewish court that executed him. It was the Roman governor who executed him. And Josephus tells us that, except in times of mass executions, the bodies were usually, they had to be buried. Even the Sadducees would agree with that. It was a command of the Torah.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So kind of related though about these Jewish burial practices is the Nicodemus and the myrrh and the aloes versus anointing. And I've noticed there has been certain contradictions or like confusion around this. So some people will say anointing, you don't anoint the body with myrrh and aloes and that sort of thing. You would use oils or perfumes. Some people are arguing that there's two anointings, one at the cross and then one in the tomb itself. And then other people have said like the myrrh and aloes would never be applied to the body or with the cloths. I think they say that's what John is saying. It was more used as a tribute fire, right? So they would burn these things, spices, as a tribute fire. And there's actually a case of them doing this for a rabbi, for Rabbi Gamaliel the second, I think, or something like that. So, what's your take on the anointing and the burial spices? How does that fit together?
Well, when Jesus gets anointed before his burial by the woman in Mark 14, Matthew 26, and John 12, John identifies her as Mary, the sister of Lazarus, and Martha, where he's anointed there. Mark says it's with myrrh. It's a myrrh-like substance, a spice of some sort. Today, and I don't know this firsthand, actually, this is from reading because I don't personally use perfume, but but today I think they're alcohol based. Is that right? I don't know. You probably don't use perfume either, but back then they were um, they were oil based, and the oil was meant to capture the scent from the myrrh or other spices.
Mm.
So anointing bodies, you could anoint the body just with oil, and actually anointing a dead body, at least with oil, was so important that, at least according to later rabbis, it was allowed on the Sabbath. So even on the Sabbath, you could wash and anoint the body, and women could wash and anoint uh, the bodies of either gender. Men could only do it with men. But in terms of anointing his body with oil, you could also work the spices into the oil so there would be a fragrant incense. We have a whole lot of uh, spice containers. Unginta, is that the name? Like broken jars or broken alabaster vials, like was used in Mark 14 and John 12, uh, in tombs in Judea. So these things were used to anoint bodies. You know, the burning of the spices might be used. I don't think that was this common. And especially you're not allowed to have a public mourning for somebody who's been executed. But they could have actually anointed him with spices even before they put him in the tomb, except, you know, again, the Sabbath was not a problem for anointing the body, but they had to go buy the spices. They weren't expecting him to get executed, so they had to go buy the spices. They had to wait till after the Sabbath was over for that. So probably Saturday evening after sundown, some of the markets would open in Jerusalem. They could buy the things, and then with the earliest morning light, they head back to the tomb to do it. And it's good he was anointed beforehand because uh,
Yep.
too late now. Uh, Something else they weren't expecting was the body not to be there.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So, all right. So, I also want to ask you about differences in the obviously, so the empty tomb narratives on the Easter Sunday morning when the women can come. Um, and if you want, also you talk about differences in the resurrection appearances that come up. You know, where did they see him in Galilee or Jerusalem? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There are a number of these, but I'll deal with the one from Galilee and Jerusalem because that's the one that's more than a minor detail. That's I think pretty big. Now, in the case of Mark, his kind of goal for his narrative is, you know, crucifixion in Jerusalem and then back to Galilee. He says Jesus says, I'll meet you in Galilee. Normally, you would expect after the festival that the disciples would have gone back to Galilee. I mean, after all, that's where they had homes. That's where they were from. Why are they going to stay in Jerusalem after the festival? However, the festival is still going on because it's not just Passover the day, it's the whole feast, Passover and unleavened bread, which were celebrated together. So 8 days altogether. So it's still going on. So even if they were just there for the festival, they wouldn't have reason to leave. If they wanted to skip town, probably most of them are staying in Bethany rather than in Jerusalem, except for the night of the Passover meal. If they wanted to skip town, because they thought that the authorities might be looking for them, going back to Galilee immediately would be actually the antithesis of a good approach, because how could you be more conspicuous than with everybody else coming into town? You're heading out. If you lie low, you can just stay put and draw less attention to yourself until everybody's leaving, and then blend into the crowds that are leaving. So it's natural that the disciples would still be in Jerusalem at this point. It's also natural that they would go back to Galilee, even if they hadn't been told to do so. After a certain period of time, they would go back. And then we know that the early church was headquartered in Jerusalem after that. Paul is clear on that, Galatians chapters 1 and 2. He also speaks of the gospel going forth from Jerusalem in Romans 15. So, we know the apostles are headquartered in Jerusalem at some point. The narratives make sense, even though each writer is going to focus on what their focus is. So this is a case where it actually does fit together very logically. And in John, of course, you've got both. You've got Jerusalem and Galilee, although many people say John 21 is a later addition, which I've argued against, and I think most narrative critics today would argue against it. But the conventional view in most of the 20th century was it's a later addition, but the vocabulary is not different from John. It's not different in style. The main thing is that it's considered anticlimactic, but anticlimax was a common thing in ancient sources. I mean, the most commonly read work among Greeks was the Iliad, and book 24 is utterly anticlimactic. So, nobody, at least in the first century, was saying that book 24 of the Iliad was a later addition and doesn't count for what Homer thought. Whatever it was originally, that's not how it was viewed in the first century.
Gotcha. Yeah, good point there. So, okay. All right. So, I think we kind of covered the contradictions or anything like that. Is there anything I missed on that front, or are you good to move on to the explanations? Is there anything like important that you wanted to mention, or?
No, I mean, I just handle them one by one, and again, I think that yeah, no, we can go on. It's fine.
Okay, so we've been looking at a lot of the biblical data and stuff on a factual level, but I just wanted to go up, given the facts that we have related to Jesus' death and resurrection. Um, what are some of the, out of the various natural explanations that attempt to try to explain this data? I'm kind of curious, like, what do you think of these natural explanations? Are they all just utter failures? Do some perform better than others? Like, what is your take on some of the skeptical attempts trying to explain the facts that we have?
Yeah. So far as I can see, they're all utter failures.
Yeah.
The idea of the swoon theory is an old view, but it doesn't account for the nature of crucifixion. It doesn't account for how's he going to move the stone that takes several people to, I mean, it's like a couple 100 pounds. Who's going to, uh, and then,
That would be a miracle in itself, I'll just say.
yeah. And then he continues to survive. He doesn't just drop over dead, but then where is he? How come they don't say, yeah, he's alive from the dead and here he is. Let's follow him. They say, well, we saw him go up to heaven. And then we have, all these things about the exalted Christ all through the New Testament where he's reigning from heaven. Uh, Going back to Psalm 110, verse 1, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. But, you know, the body's missing, and people believe they've seen him alive from the dead, and he's not still here. So the stolen body idea, there weren't very many stolen bodies in Judea and Galilee. I mean, it's not to say nobody ever stole bodies, but normally tomb robbers, which weren't very common in Judea and Galilee, but in the broader world, if they thought it was a rich tomb, sometimes people would rob the tomb, but it wasn't the body they were normally looking for, unless they wanted it for witchcraft, and so, okay, well, Jesus was this powerful sorcerer. Let's, take pieces of his body, whatever. But again, it is very uncommon, and it doesn't explain the resurrection appearances.
Yeah.
Unless you say, okay, well, maybe the disciples stole the body and they all lied about it. They all colluded to say that Jesus rose from the dead. Well, why would they do that? They weren't being hunted down at this point, but they're going to get themselves hunted down for claiming that. And we know that they faced persecution. Again, even if you only accept Paul's letters, one of his earliest letters, First Thessalonians, he talks about persecution in Judea. One of his other earliest letters in Galatians, he talks about persecution in Judea and that he was one of the ones doing it.
Right.
And he talks about that elsewhere. We've mentioned in other connections.
Mhm.
So that doesn't make sense. They would have to all be suicidal or masochistic. And I mean, especially Jesus was executed on the charge of treason against the majesty of the emperor. He was executed on the charge of claiming to be king of the Jews, which the disciples obviously didn't get the idea from Pilate. Pilate didn't get the idea from the disciples. Connect the dots, goes back to Jesus. Somebody leaked I guess, the inside information. Actually, toward the end, he was talking about it anyway, but um, uh, that would be really fun to go into the more details on that, but just trying to stick with where we're at, because I would not be a good railroad conductor. I lose my train of thought. I don't have a one-track mind. I
That's yeah, you in a
too ADHD.
yeah, that's totally fine. That you guys are like brilliant, right? 'Cause you come up with a million different ideas and stuff like that. So
But where was I before I went off track?
yeah, yeah. Well, I think you covered the swoon theory, you covered the stolen body.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hallucinations. Now, hallucinations could explain the uh, hallucinations don't explain the appearances very well, but if they did explain the appearances, they still don't explain the empty tomb. So you'd have to combine them with one of the other extremely unlikely possibilities that, well, the swoon theory, you couldn't even, it'd have to be a stolen body plus a bunch of hallucinations. Maybe the stolen body sparked off the hallucinations. But again, it's not just one or two people having hallucinations. You've got a bunch of people having them on multiple occasions, sometimes multiple people at once. I mean, you got a room full of people tripping on LSD. They're all not all going to hallucinate the same thing. All listening to Led Zeppelin, but they're not all going to hallucinate the same thing.
yeah,
And some people, one, there have been comparisons some people have made with Marian apparitions,
yeah.
where you do have multiple people seeing Mary at once. But again, we're assuming that that's a hallucination. What
Right.
if it's really an apparition? Something more veridical. maybe not physical, but veridical.
Could be an
So
objective vision, is what.
yeah, because psychologically, it's so unlikely that something like this would happen with more than one person at a time. Uh, and the idea of bereavement hallucinations, again, with all these people, and if we take the Gospels as evidence, multiple uh, multiple senses happening, and also for all 12 plus the 500 and so on. I mean, the 12, most disciples back then were teenagers. Peter may have been a little bit older, maybe over 18 because he was married. But most disciples in antiquity were teenagers, and teenagers aren't usually the ones known for having that kind of hallucination. Now, it is possible. Well, I think it was past teenager. I think one time I went to work, I was working maintenance, and I hadn't had enough sleep. Yeah,
Yeah.
lack of sleep, and I'm sure the disciples did have lack of sleep at that point. But again, to all hallucinate the same thing, and it
Yeah.
just doesn't. And then to
Even
be
with social like coordination and contagion, you still wouldn't expect to get everyone seeing the same thing at the same time.
and they're also certain about it, that they are prepared to die for their testimony. Certainly, they're being persecuted for it,
Mhm.
and some of them certainly did die for their testimony. And you've got Paul, who's completely turned around. Yeah, the none of the explanations, naturalistic explanations, work nearly as well. Occam's razor. Now, Occam's razor can be kind of a dull blade at times, but I mean, with all the evidence put together, the only reason not to accept the resurrection hypothesis would be if you are certain that there's no such thing as God, or no such thing as anything supernatural. Otherwise, a supernatural explanation, it's a whole lot, um, requires a whole lot fewer leaps of logic to illogical things.
Well, that's a perfect segue, right? Because that's exactly what the skeptics say with my next question here. What one thing I own your 2-volume work on miracles, so that I would love to again, if I'm not annoying you, hopefully you're having a good time. You're welcome back to discuss those books specifically if you'd like. Because I have a friend who's writing his own book on miracles and stuff as well. So maybe you can come back on a future show, but for this episode, I just want to briefly ask you because look, the number one objection among people, atheists, to scholars like Bart Ehrman, um, they don't really like to get into theories and try to explain the facts. They just say, well, we don't know. It was too long ago. But I do know it wasn't a miracle because miracles are a priori impossible. So, you've written extensively about this argument from David Hume and other skeptics today who kind of assume a naturalist or naturalism kind of worldview where miracles can just be dismissed right off the bat. So I want to turn it over to you. Like, what isn't this a good objection? Why would we assume that miracles are possible or let alone the most probable explanation for something?
Claiming that miracles are impossible, like claiming that miracles happen, are both presuppositions, they're both assumptions. If you want to actually have an intellectual discussion, an academic, open-minded, fair discussion about whether or not miracles happen, then let's look at evidence regarding them. But most people today who deny that miracles happen a priori are assuming that David Hume, or they're assuming that somebody, maybe they don't know the name of David Hume, but ultimately the arguments go back to David Hume. David Hume actually didn't come up with the arguments himself. He's recycling earlier deist arguments, as I think it's Robert Burns showed in a dissertation several decades ago. Just sometimes word for word. They didn't have the same plagiarism requirements back then.
That's not
But
the is that the book Hume's Abject Failure
no,
or
no, no. That one was by John Ehrman, Earman. Yeah, Hume's Abject Failure is Argument for Miracles, and then somebody uh, critiqued the book saying, "You just told that because you're a Christian." To which Ehrman said, "Actually, I'm not a Christian. I just thought it was his worst argument." But anyway, yeah, he published that with Oxford, and there are other major university press publications challenging Hume's argument. And of course, it gets debated back and forth. But uh, Hume borrowed a lot from the deists, and that's why some things don't seem to make sense in his argument, because there are gaps where he's just assuming certain deist premises that he doesn't feel he needs to state, because it was kind of, some of it was in the air. But Hume is the one who really made a splash with it because of his authority on other things. His skeptical epistemology really influenced a lot of philosophy for a long time. Although this particular essay contradicts Hume's normal epistemology, his normal way of trying to figure out truth. And so Hume makes an a priori argument rather than looking at experiences in this case. Now he's got two sections of his argument. The first section is that miracles are violations of natural law, which is, and he says natural law can't be violated, therefore miracles can't happen. That's just a play on, he's playing with words, and he's using a definition of natural law that doesn't fit the descriptive understandings of natural law today. It also didn't fit the understanding of natural law in his day, because he's following Newton, but Newton and his early followers all believed in biblical miracles. So they weren't saying these things didn't happen because we all hold this mechanistic view of nature. They said God is the legislator of natural law. He's not bound by it. He can act within it anytime he wants to. If I drop this pen and then catch it, I haven't violated the law of gravity. I've acted within nature. What kind of God would be less powerful than us? I mean, why worship a God that's less powerful than us? So that argument that Hume raises doesn't actually challenge any theistic view of God. Would challenge a deistic. If you start with deistic or atheistic premises, maybe it works, but not for a theist. So, and actually, the idea that miracles are violations of natural law itself is a controversial premise. People before him, like Augustine and Aquinas, could say that miracles are above nature, but they would never say they were violations of nature, as if God is subject to nature. And you look in the Bible, like where God parts the sea in Exodus 14 with a strong east wind. Well, how is that a violation of nature? Wind set down occurs. Now, the fact that it happens to occur at the very time when the Israelites need to cross, they cross on dry ground, and then it closes back on their enemies after them. I mean, that's, remarkable, but it's not a violation of natural law. Maybe the virgin birth, maybe the, Jesus' resurrection to a new order of existence, we could maybe speak of those, maybe in such terms, walking on water. But even stilling storms are not violations of natural law. Storms still all the time. But anyway, moving on to his second argument. His second argument is, if these things happened then, they'd still happen. You'd have credible eyewitnesses for these things. And we don't have any credible eyewitnesses for these things. The only places where people believe in these things are primitive, superstitious people. And here his ethnocentrism, there are reasons why even a century after him, slaveholders were quoting Hume in support of slavery and in support of the inferiority of non-white peoples. His whole view of history was so ethnocentric. He's, no great civilizations with art and all these things, technology apart from white civilizations. Well, he defines Egypt as a white civilization. What about China? What about, there were other empires in Africa, other empires in Asia that he just, and in Latin America, well, wasn't Latin, well, it was Latin by that point, but anyway,
Yeah.
South America and Central America, but and then there are other components of that, but he couldn't get away with that today. He says, oh yeah, and you've got this example and that example, but we can dismiss those. So, for example, he says, um, I think it was Madame Perrier. I may have the wrong name, but she was Pascal's niece, and she had a running eye sore. She was touched with a holy thorn from Jesus' crown of thorns at a Jansenist monastery, instantly publicly healed from this organic condition. The Queen Mother of France sent her own physician who verified this. So Hume says, we know this didn't happen, so why would we accept anything else? That's his argument. He
Yeah.
doesn't even try to, he says this meets all my criteria and it doesn't work. Well, okay, I don't believe it was a holy thorn from Jesus' crown of thorns. I think Luther was probably right that there were enough nails left over from the Holy Cross to shoe every horse in Saxony, and
Yeah.
wondered why there were 13 of the original 12 apostles buried in Germany. I mean, there were a lot of fake relics
Yeah.
in circulation,
For
but it
sure.
was a contact point for her faith. It was an act of faith. She was healed, and it's medically documented. Well, today, I don't think Hume would even try this argument. There was a Pew Forum survey in 2006, I believe it was, of just 10 countries where the total number from the, extrapolating the numbers from the survey, the total number of people who claim to have witnessed divine healing comes out to hundreds of millions of people in those 10 countries. And you know, and then you've got it in multiple religions. That was one of his arguments against it. Well, you've got it in this religion, that religion, that religion, so they all cancel each other out. Who says that works?
Yeah, he's
But
assuming that their purpose is to authenticate the religions instead of miracles of compassion,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Atheists get
And
healed, right? So yeah.
yeah, and just yeah, and there, from theistic grounds, there are reasons for interpreting certain ones in certain ways, so presuppositions do affect how we view them, but you can't just say, well, they don't happen because everybody claims them. Wait, how does that work?
Yeah.
And and we could go on with that, but um and also these are, you have millions of people converted to Christianity in recent decades through, I mean, it wasn't just like somebody prayed for me, my headache went away. It was like things so dramatic that they weren't explained by these cultures' indigenous healing traditions. People embracing great social cost, abandoning centuries of certain kinds of ancestral traditions to follow Jesus, sometimes facing great persecution to do so. In around the year 2000, there was a report from within the China Christian Council, affiliated with the Three Self Church, the official, more or less official church in China, that said that half of all conversions in the previous 20 years were due to faith healing experiences. Well, there were millions of people in China converted during that time to Christianity. The house church estimates were much higher than that. Well, some of the house church estimates that I've seen were like closer to 90%, at least in rural areas. So, you know, Dr. Balkrishna Sharma in Nepal shared with me, he thought it was like 80% of Christians in Nepal had been converted through healing or deliverance or something like that. And of course, you've got all over the Islamic world where people are being converted through dreams and visions, or
Yeah.
at least that's part of the conversion story. Uh,
Nabil Qureshi is a case.
I hadn't, I was about to say Nabil because he's beloved by many of us, but yeah, um, and we could go on, but
Yeah,
just to say, I don't think David Hume was a smart man. You may disagree with him, but I don't think he would have made that argument today. You go back and you read his argument, a lot of it's circular. Certainly the first half of his argument is entirely circular. But with hundreds of millions of witnesses, and he says, well, they have to be educated, have something to lose. Well, I can give you scores of examples. I mean, I'm sure there are more than scores, but I mean, I can name scores of examples of people that I know, including myself and my wife, both have PhDs, who are well educated, certainly have something to lose, sticking our neck out, talking about it in public, in circles that, I mean, not in the seminary where I teach, but in academia as a whole, um, doesn't do anything good for my reputation with a lot of people who are detractors. But I've seen it, so why should I have to keep my mouth shut about it if I believe it's true?
exactly.
Anyway,
Exactly. Yeah, no, I fully agree. Yeah. And one thing I'll just quickly add about David Hume is that there's another objection that you might not have heard about, but it's from my background in philosophy, where there's a field called the epistemology of testimony. And
mhm,
David Hume assumes, in fact, he invented this without realizing it, but he believes in reductive testimony. So to keep it simple, testimony is to be disbelieved unless you have independent proof that it's true. Whereas most philosophers and epistemologists today go for the non-reductive, where
right.
no, we believe it. It's a basic source of knowledge unless we have reason to doubt. So yeah,
He, his approach would make historiography impossible, and
exactly.
also journalism, and also law, and actually, for that matter, sociology and anthropology.
Exactly. And he would make it impossible for me to get pizza when I ask someone on the street for directions. I
Yeah,
trust their testimony that if they tell me it's 2 blocks down, we believe them usually, right? So yeah,
yeah, unless you have reason not to.
exactly. Exactly. So okay, so here's the my last favorite question on the list of the interview before we go to the next segment here. But so I'm kind of known for my Shroud Warriors series. I'm on the pro Shroud side with Dr. Gary Habermas. Now I remember reading in your commentary. I tried to figure out your position, and true to form, as a good scholar, I couldn't figure it out because you gave both the pro and the con. So I'm kind of curious, like what is your position on the Shroud of Turin?
Position might not be a good word for somebody who hasn't researched it as much as you have, um, but with the newer studies that deal with radiocarbon dating, and show, yeah, it was just a patch in the shroud that was tested before, and the newer study says it's a first century cloth. At least that's my understanding of the newer
The
study.
like the X-ray dating you're talking about, right? The Waxis thing that just came out in 2022. You're
Yeah, 2022.
yeah, yeah. It
Yeah,
dates the first century. Yeah,
yeah. So with that, I mean, I think it's everything put together. It, I don't see any other explanation that works. That's not a positive yes. It's just I don't see anything else that works. Uh,
yeah.
I mean, obviously, this is of a crucified man. If it's of a crucified man, most crucified men don't have shrouds like this.
Mhm.
Uh, it doesn't make sense for something else. So um, I would just say, based on the current evidence, looks like it's authentic. Uh, Keeping open in case something something in the future points in a different way, but I don't know what that would be. But
Yeah, yeah.
maybe we find out that there were medieval alchemists who had power to create a first century cloth, and
Well,
I it just
what I heard the most recent thing is Dale Allison's appeal to rainbow bodies. Somebody
yeah
tried to apply that to the shroud too. So yeah, but no, I think it's obvious. It's proof of the resurrection of
yeah
Jesus.
I don't think the rainbow I don't know, Dale wouldn't apply rainbow body to the shroud, would he? I don't think that would work.
I don't think it would work
The
either, right?
shroud.
'Cause, yeah, the body shrink and all it doesn't make sense. Yeah. So All right, cool. So with that said, that's it for sort of the interview proper on this show. Now the reason I'm kind of dressed up here and Craig was kind enough to do this interview is I'm doing a special for Gary Habermas, a celebration show to honor his legacy and the fact that he just finished his 4 volume work on the evidence for the resurrection. And Craig is kind enough to give sort of a speech or you know a series of sentences, whatever you want to do, sort of you know honoring Gary's legacy. So without further ado, I'll give it over to you to give your speech. And yeah,
Maybe in honor of minimal facts arguments, I'll keep it short, but uh, that's just a joke. But uh, yeah, Gary is the kind of the father of this research, I think, in evangelical circles. He is, I mean, he Mike Licona is one of his proteges, and I certainly have learned very much from Gary and from Mike, some of which Mike got from Gary, and he uh, he's been persistent with this, and he's been so kind. I don't know how he can answer all of his emails and and mentor so many people so closely. I mean, there's only so much time in the day. I try to do my best, but I can't keep up with everything. But Gary is faithful in all that. He's a down to earth guy, so friendly, and this is a magnum opus. These 4 volumes. Now, having said that, I've only read 2 of them so far, because I think that I don't know if the third one is out. I've only seen the
it's
2.
coming out May 15th for the third
Okay,
one. Yeah.
so I haven't seen it yet, but but he's just such a thorough researcher and so uh, incessant with his logic, and yet um, fair to the different views. His minimal facts approach uh, is also very important, not just with regard to the resurrection, but it's important for building common ground. It's like Paul in Acts chapter 17 on the Areopagus. He starts by building common ground. And when Paul preaches in synagogues, he starts from scripture, which makes sense for people who accept scripture, but for people who don't, you know, he quotes Greek poets in Acts 17. Everything he says is biblical there, and everything he says in Acts 14, 15 to 17 is biblical, but he he frames it in a way that would be intelligible to the people with whom he's dialoguing. And Gary, in the same way, is able to dialogue with the rest of scholarship. And I think it's a great approach, and it's been helpful for I think all of us.
Great, awesome. Thank you so much for that, Craig. I really appreciate it. And it's an honor to have you involved in this. I'm calling it the ultimate resurrection panel show. So I'm hoping it'll make Gary proud because he was I was one of those anonymous emails where he helped me. I was an unbeliever, and I met him in 2010, and for 8 years he put up with my constant skeptical questions and it was in large part because of him, others as well, but you know, him month after month, he was there to answer my questions. So yeah, I wouldn't be a Christian if it weren't for Gary's work.
You're making me feel bad because I've got
Oh no, no,
I can't keep up with all the emails I get. I
yeah,
wish I could, but I can't. Yeah.
I know. Well, I'm there with you. I'm nowhere near as good as Gary is. You know, he's talking about to me about he's answering 300 or 400 emails in a weekend. I can't do that. I don't know how he does that. So
Wow.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
yes.
amazing.
But yeah, but you are someone I'm indebted to as well. I mean, you are a scholar's scholar, as Gary always phrased it, and you come on and you're willing to help people. So I appreciate you coming on and letting me ask you my interview questions. I hope you
Thanks.
enjoyed your time.
Sure, I did. And maybe you can cut this up into multiple segments. I know we went like over 2 hours, so
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll put it into I usually post my shows long form, but I'll post it in shorter segments. And you're free to post this up in whole or in part on your own channel if you like as well. So
well, I
yeah.
mean, you can do it however you want to, but I'll, I will Hey, actually, that's good because I'm always behind on having things to post online too. So if you send me the link or
Yeah.
links,
Do
yeah,
you want so yeah, we'll talk after the recording. Let me know how you want me to divide it up and I'll do that for you and you can post it. So
or
all
you
right.
can, but you kind of talked about sections, and so you could just divide it into the sections you talked about
That's a good idea. Yeah,
if you
like
want to do.
evidence section and okay. All right, cool. So there we go. We've got a plan of action. And yeah, thank you so much, Craig, for coming on. And just so the audience knows, so you're not done with me this week. I've got another live show. This one it's going to be a debate on the Shroud of Turin, actually,
Oh,
with a couple of Shroud skeptics, Digital Gnosis and James Fedor. So we're going to be discussing, they did a 10-hour podcast, and I listened to all of that, believe it or not. So yeah, we're going to be responding and going over some of the errors as I see it and discussing it. So look out for that on Thursday. But otherwise, have a great day.
thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
You're welcome.